Hi, everyone. So we continue our discussion of bilingual speech. We're towards the last leg. So we spoke about code switching earlier. So in most multilingual settings, there are no strict or explicit guidelines for what language to speak. So code switching is the act of when people decide to switch from one code to another or to mix codes within very short utterances. The term, however, for code switching is losing currency. As mentioned, other people are adopting alternative terms that they believe are perhaps more accurate or more accurately capture the dynamic nature in which people use multiple languages or multiple symbols to conduct communication. Code switching can be studied from a structural perspective, and usually when it's studied from a structural perspective, people call it code switching. So it could be looked at from a variety of ways. You can analyze the social implications behind using bilingual speech, or the political norms in that place and whether they allow for using two languages or whether the languages are in competition with one another and they indicate different national allegiances or alliances to different cultures. You could also get a sense that the linguistic marketplace, meaning that you can maybe interpret the language that is perceived as most prestigious, or if both of them are equally as prestigious. And also looking at bilingual and multilingual discourse, that tells you a little bit as well about people's emotions, because sometimes there are certain emotions that are reproduced or are communicated adopting a particular language. So as well, you can also study not just the meaning behind bilingual speech, but you can also look at the underlying principles or rules that speakers abide by whenever they engage in code switching in the first place, right? So you have here the role of popular culture and target language investments and how these can influence someone's likelihood to use bilingual speech within the context of Puerto Rico. So here you see Fiorella, who's a character under discussion. She's using borrowings. She's talking about TV shows from North American culture, English language. And then she kind of that kind of triggers her to go into English mode. And then she goes to Spanish. And then she goes back to English. So she says, okay, Rain, let's see, Pretty Little Liars, Rain, American Horror Story. Oh my God, there's so much. Cuando son episodios nuevos, los veo por internet porque I don't have cable, but I still use my ex-boyfriend's Netflix. Okay, so this kind of bilingual utterance is the depictive of this back and forth, this hybrid movement that a lot of us are aware of that happened within the context of Puerto Rico, especially because of U.S. imperial influence and all this influence from the entertainment industry, such that talking about that subject could serve as a trigger to go into English mode and then Spanish and then, you know, engage in this structural play. Here's another example. In this example, we have a Puerto Rican subject and they are using both English and Spanish to talk about their own national identity as Puerto Rican. Now, this one's a little bit odd because usually a lot of Puerto Ricans look at Spanish as like la madre patria, vernacular language, the language in my national anthem. So it's a little bit strange to see someone in their performance and construction of Puerto Rican identity, hablando de Puerto Rico, doing so using two languages. So this is Tatiana. She says, well, damn, bueno, no sé, defining Puerto Rican identity. Maybe le explicaría más o menos cómo somos nosotros y que we are nice, we are not that evil y que no estamos como los indígenas que pues, que tenemos technology y que they should visit us. So it almost seems in this discourse that she's kind of struggling or communicating her inside self, right? Her inside self, or the Spanish content is that has to do with us, the us language or the us of Puerto Rico. Bueno, no sé, maybe le explicaría talking about them, como somos nosotros, y que, and then she goes into English, and what she would tell them specifically in English: we are nice, we're not that evil. And then she goes back to Spanish to talk to me, como, y que no estamos como que los indígenas, y que pues, then she goes back and uses the word technology, que de Estados Unidos, like we associate it with English language culture. So she's kind of like using these two hats to communicate meaning and interaction and communicate Puerto Rican culture to an outsider. So she's doing that using bilingual speech. So code switching structural models, some of the most common types of switchings involve the use of nouns and verbs from another language. So various models have been proposed to describe the structure of code switching. Our book only mentions two. So in terms of studying the structure of English, we can adopt the matrix language frame. And this is, whenever we say la matriz, we're talking about a dominant language. So usually in a bilingual interaction, there is a main underlying structure. And that underlying structure that decides what components can come in can either be language A as a matrix, or it could be language B as a matrix, or there could be a hybrid matrix of A, B. So puede ser el español, el idioma que domina, puede ser el inglés, el idioma que domina, and then you insert Spanish. O puede ser mixto, la matriz, the matrix, the dominant status quo. So these three styles will be covered under the matrix language frame. So it's based on the assumption that one language is dominant in that grammatical frame, and the only ones are only switched or inserted into this main frame. Then the second way that code switching has been analyzed in terms of structure is by adopting generative syntactic theory, or Chomskyan syntax, Chomsky. So the minimalist program, or Chomskyan linguistics, talks about parts of speech, like si algo, if something has un sustantivo, una combinación de un sustantivo y un determinante, noun, phrase, determiner, like it considers parts of speech, which are nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, etc. And it considers as well phrases that are larger combinations of parts of speech. So you could have a determiner plus a noun equals a noun phrase, or you could have a clause, una cláusula, so a simple clause is a subject plus a predicate. So this kind of structural way of describing code switching would fall under the minimalist program. But our book mainly focused on social models of defining why a code switch occurs. So code switching typology, there is one that is about the social motivation behind code switching or using bilingual speech. And this is one by Bloom and Gumpers in 1972. So what motivation could I have that leads me to engage in a bilingual act? So sometimes the reason why I decide to use bilingual speech is because of my situation. So usually, this is when languages change according to the situations in which the speakers find themselves in. So maybe I'm with my friends, and that kind of code or the style that I've adopted with my friends is bilingual. So estoy situationally in that persona. However, if I go elsewhere, pues estoy hablando otro idioma, right? So I'm adapting to that situation, no? And then another reason why I may choose to engage in bilingual speech is to create meaning in a sentence that's not necessarily to do with situation, but it could be down to as an additional effect, o como que an additional layer of meaning en mi oración. So for instance, in this sense, I can say that, so to do with the meaning or value attached to a prescribed language. So yo puedo decir, I'm talking in English, blah, 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 yeah, you know, yo soy boricua, para que tú lo sepas. Suddenly, I changed to Spanish to assert my Hispanic identity, and I use an idiom to say boricua para que tú lo sepas. So in that case, I'm using bilingual speech because I want to create meaning rather than just saying I'm Puerto Rican. I want to add that additional layer of meaning that I'm using Spanish as I say it. So I'm drawing on the meaning of Spanish as the emblem of national Puerto Rican identity, and I'm using it to as an insight or fill in my bilingual speech. Okay, so those are two kinds of switchings that Bloom and Gumpers detected. So ones that are down to situation and ones that are more down to meaning or wanting to create an additional meaning effect. And now finally, we're going to talk about other factors that could influence my decision to be bilingual or multilingual in speech. And this factor, specifically the one that we're going to talk about right now, is called accommodation and audience design. So accommodation theory is one that was developed by Howard Giles in the 1980s to refer to the act that sometimes when we're talking to people, and I suppose this kind of fits into situational language use. When we're talking to people like friends, family members, strangers, we kind of accommodate to them. We accommodate to what we perceive them to be, their values, their practices. We also accommodate according to whether we want to establish rapport with that person or we want to distance ourselves to that person. So we deliberately use language to converge. So converge is to close that gap between myself, that psychological gap between myself and my audience, or diverge, which is distance myself from somebody through language. So Lepage says that we do not necessarily adapt to the style of the interlocutor, but rather to an image that we have of ourselves in relation to our interlocutor. So what is my role in relation to the person that I'm speaking to? How do I envision myself in relation to my mom? And how do I take up my role as the youngest daughter when I talk to her? How do I do that with my boss? How do I see my relation with my boss? Do I see it as one that's intimate or friendly, or do I see it as one that, I want to create my distance? Like, how do I perceive my relation, and how do I use language to build that or establish that? And then we have another theory that's very similar to accommodation theory. In fact, many people use them interchangeably, which is called audience design. So audience design is similar to accommodation theory. It was proposed by Alan Bell, and it can be seen as an extension specifically of the term convergence that is used in accommodation theory. So convergence is like closing that gap between yourself and somebody else. So in audience design, speakers deal with listeners by orienting their speech towards others through code choices. So they design their styles primarily for and in response to their audience. So their audience could be a third reference party. It could be like alguien que me está escuchando, and then I'm kind of aware that they're there. Referee design, or an idea. I could also be accommodating to this idea that I have that an academic is supposed to sound like. So then I decide that I'm, gonna like showcase that. So under this term, individual speakers use style and other aspects of their language repertoire to represent their identity or lay claim to other people's or others' identities. And another related term to audience design is speaker design. So speaker design used by Natalie Schilling Estes. So speaker design is the use of language as a resource in the actual creation presentation, and recreation of speaker identity. So I'm using language as a symbolic tool to construct my identity, and I'm designing it according to context. So it's a little bit more broad and distance from the audience or the addressee. But again, it kind of hints at this notion that language is a symbolic tool that we can use in the construction of our identity or in engaging in stylistic acts of language. So we already discussed the markedness model, and we've kind of spoken about multilingual identities. So in our next class, we're going to talk about the theme of our next chapter, which is chapter 5, I believe, and we're going to talk about language variation. So that's going to be our next video, okay? See you soon.